Although many people believe the teaching profession is a standard job for a woman to have, teachers have evolved over the decades to show they are so much more.
The field of teaching was predominantly a female profession that was underpaid and overworked,
thus transforming into a unionized subculture of academia that allowed women to expand their knowledge and broaden their own lives in professional ways, while also allowing them to explore their sexuality.
After the Revolution, teaching opened up as a profession. Teaching during the late 18th century was a way for women to temporarily free themselves of ordinary constraints of marriage and motherhood. Teaching offered refuge to nonconformists, and in this case to lesbians. Many women who were lesbians felt they had to marry men for economic reasons. However, teaching provided a way for women to earn a respectable source of independent income. In 1792, the first institution of higher education for girls in the United States opened. It was called Litchfield Female Academy and was founded by a woman named Sarah Pierce. Pierce longed for a utopian domestic space and landscape that would serve as a refuge for women from the tyrannies of marriage and the dangers of childbearing. She would write about her opposition to marriage, as well as write about her dream of building a house with their friend Abigail Smith. She actually wrote one of the first lesbian poems in American literature. Sarah Pierce composed verses that were written in the winter of 1792. These poems were dedicated to her close friend Abigail Smith. The two women made a vow to spend the rest of their lives together. When she died at age 83, she never married. During the 19th century, it was rare for women to live together because of the limited economic opportunities for women and discriminatory laws about property ownership. Historian Rachel Hope Cleaves researched and wrote about two white women who lived together after the Revolution. Their names are Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. Charity was born in 1777 and was raised in Massachusetts. At the age of 22, she was banished from her home because of her attraction towards women. Charity admired that several of her teachers, like herself, never acquired a husband or married late in life. Charity found being a teacher convenient because school districts typically sought out unmarried women for the job. Charity may have also found it appealing to become a teacher because of the schoolroom's reputation as a place where women could form intimacies with other women. Within their circle, the women created an effective world of language and ideas, and were far removed from the domestic, wifely, and maternal love expected of early American women. Political literature described these relationships in platonic terms, but reform tracts, medical texts, pornography, and certain risky novels described the schoolhouse as a place where girl students and teachers exchanged dirty stories and pleasured each other. One pornographic newspaper published in New York City in the 1840s even ran an advertisement for a girls' boarding school in its classified section. The school was a potential training ground in the imagination of the post-revolutionary generation. Charity accepted her first teaching job when her sister Anna lured her to Dartmouth by writing to her and promising that her friend Eliza, another teacher in the district, would make her pleased. Gossip at the time played a prominent role in regulating early national society. Gossip about women focused on the singular attention on sexual behavior. Because women had limited roles in the public sphere, their public reputations depended on how well they performed their modesty and chastity demanded from their sex. Charity formed many intimate relationships between other women when she moved to Dartmouth. and she was forced to leave several jobs because of hurtful gossip about her relationships with these women. In 1807, Charity moved to Vermont to stay with a friend, and there she met Sylvia. The two fell in love, set up housekeeping, and considered themselves married. Gradually, their family members and the residents of Weybridge did as well. Charity scraped by on poor wages as a school teacher, then later established a sewing business with Sylvia. Together for more than 40 years, Sylvia and Charity worked for their tailor shop without rest. They sacrificed their sleep and health to earn enough to support each other. They worked up to 18 hours of labor a day sewing for men, women, and children. In the end, Charity and Sylvia remained passionately committed to each other and refused to hide their relationship.
Although many believe the teaching profession to be equally dominated between men and women, the feminization of teaching has existed since the early 19th century, thus resulting in the field being dominated by women. Women made a natural fit as teachers due to their standard day-to-day roles, as well as the nurturing nature given to young minds. I'm going to make a few points that show how the teaching role was feminized over time. First, I will talk about how the task of instructing children was delegated to the household's literate females. Second, I will talk about how it was quickly determined in the United States that women simply made for better teachers. Finally, I will talk about the rising demand for women to take on the role of teacher in the United States. By the time I finish talking, I'd like to think that maybe there will be a greater appreciation for women as teachers. I will now discuss how the task of instructing children was delegated to the household's literate females. Homeschooling was a very common practice in the United States in the 1800s. A mother's to-do for the household in those days may have included things such as sewing, keeping up the house, cooking, and for those that were literate, teaching children the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as common home economics. While boarding schools were common during this era, it was a more natural fit for a mother to educate her children, as it was seen more as a child-rearing duty, whereas boarding schools were viewed more as higher institutions of learning generally reserved for the male demographic. While the means of being able to read and write were not something a person of color would have access to learning, the child-rearing duties of minorities and slaves during this era were like that of a white woman. A woman of color would have had the same responsibility to teach her children the fundamentals of learning to the best of her ability. Hopefully, I have given you a good idea about how the task of teaching was delegated. My next point I will now discuss is how it was determined that women, simply put, made for better teachers in the United States. In the 1880s, kindergarten through 12th grade students were taught by a combination of women and men, in which 40% of the teachers in the US were made up of men. By the time the 1920s came around, the number of teachers grew by almost 2.5, but the percentage of male teachers drastically decreased to only 16%. Two states, Indiana and Kansas, had a greater majority of male teachers during this time due to their reluctance to hire women. However, these states also ranked the lowest when it came to literacy among other areas of learning. States that had most of their teachers as female fared much better in terms of academic achievement, class sizes, demand, and the quality of the teachers. I feel it goes without saying based on the data that I provided, but I'll say it anyway. How could one not see that male teachers simply didn't perform as well as their female counterparts? This leads me to my final point of the rising demand for women to take on the role of teacher in the United States. As I previously stated, it quickly became apparent that female teachers were preferred over their male counterparts, whether it be because of their higher success of literacy and understanding, or simply the nurturing nature they give to students, so much to the point that some might refer to them as mom on accident. Despite these attributes, the demand for the women teachers rose primarily due to a simple numbers game. Women were far more willing to work as a teacher than a man was, and due to this primary trait, they fell victim to low labor costs. more and more schools were able to become publicly available simply because women were ready, willing, and able to expand the minds of the youth for an amount of money simply not comparable to her male counterparts. It was also understood that the teaching role would go to a woman who was generally single and did not have any children. If a point in time came in which that woman decided it was time to marry and or have kids, that meant it was time to retire from teaching, as her man would then take on the role of breadwinner. Thus the demand increased due to women simply wanting to live their lives. The bottom line is the role women have played in teaching has changed over the decades, but the fact remains that the caring nature, natural responsibilities to children, higher literacy, and, unfortunately, lower labor costs all contributed to the profession being a prime position for a woman to take possession of.
Americans have come to know teachers as obedient, submissive caregivers and disciplinarians, but one characteristic that have mixed opinions about this group of women-dominating profession is their ability to unionize to influence policy action. With over 3.4 million members, teachers have built relationships amongst groups of unions like the National Education Association and American Federation of Teachers that have brought social and political change on local, state, and federal levels. These women teacher activists fought against harassment, poor pay and working conditions, and gender inequality in education, amongst many other important issues. The teaching profession began informally with the women in the home, which led to male-paid teachers in the late 18th century. This was because women were confined to housework and reared the children by ways of Republican motherhood. After the Great Depression, however, these numbers changed, and thousands of women became teachers. White women were paid less than men, and black women were paid over half less, supported by the terms of the National Industrial Recovery Act, where different codes were legally given to pay women less, and women of color disproportionately less, leaving farm and domestic work completely out of the act. By 1936, the Great Depression had influenced the social norms so much that many people believed the proper place for a woman was in the home.
Okay.
According to the Gallup poll of 1936, 82% of respondents believed that in the nuclear family, if the man had a job, the woman should not work. Further, women were fired at disproportionate rates of their male counterparts, totaling thousands. On the other hand, women did not give up and surprisingly increased in employment rates from 25% in the 1930s to 27% in the 1940s. Black women felt the hit of the Great Depression the most because there was no relief offered to farm and domestic work, which was the vast majority of where black women were eligible for hire. In all, women teachers fought back by unionizing. Thus, relationships among women shared values, led to networks and political pressuring, and opened policy windows for governmental action. The National Labor Relations Act, rolled out in 1935, giving collective bargaining or unionization legal ground. This was a game changer for how teachers could negotiate their employment contracts and benefits. Prior to collective bargaining laws, teachers were, by law, not allowed to unionize, picket, strike, or walk out without the threat of being fired from their job. By 1945, nearly 100% of teachers were protected by collective bargaining agreements. Although the annual teacher salary only increased slightly after collective bargaining laws, states without these laws were paid much lower teacher salaries. The civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s helped inspire the women's movement, as did earlier movements in the 19th century. Gender equity policy coalitions came together and aimed at getting government policy for equity in equal pay, maternity benefits, women in leadership, childcare, and reproductive rights. Title IX of the Education Amendments Acts of 1972 prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex to be excluded from participating and benefiting from any education program receiving federal aid. It passed, in part because women teachers held strikes and picketed, rallied, marched, and walked out of their jobs in support of the title. 14 states passed their versions of Title IX, but there was pushback, and most universities responded by saying they were protecting their male sports teams.
Sports are important, okay? You got a sports, you like some sports.
Further, Title IX was unenforceable because there was no guidelines or support for the new mandates, and no penalties for noncompliance unless individuals sued. Later, in 1988, the Civil Rights Restoration Act clarified Title IX by including all programs and activities, even if the particular program or activity did not receive federal funding. While teachers were fighting for education reform with Title IX, teacher union activists also fought for teachers' pregnancy leave rights locally and learned how to ally themselves to state and national gender equity pay policy networks. Women teacher union activism, presence outside the courtroom picketing, helped influence the Supreme Court's decision for women's reproductive rights in 1973, Roe v. Wade, where abortion became legal in all 50 states. In 1976, teachers attempted to strike to have states recognize their unions to really allow collective bargaining. Striking at this time was illegal, and they would be thrown in jail. However, that was the strength of the strike, the mere fact that it was illegal. When the public saw the teachers out on picket lines for upwards of 7 weeks and picked up and brought to jail by the police, the public would not turn on the teachers, rather would be sympathetic. They would say, "Now, if these little old ladies are willing to engage in this sort of thing, somebody must have done something wrong to them."
Yeah, so I totally thought it was interesting how the whole old school girl fetish sexiness came from your report.
Oh yeah, how they would have like the schools for girls in the classified section of newspaper. Like it was something to hide.
Like seriously, how'd they get away with that?
It just blows my mind because it seems like it's, especially nowadays in today's culture, it seems like that is a very common fetish, but you don't think about where it comes from, and I didn't realize until you started doing the research that that's basically it. I never would have guessed.
Yeah, that more than just grooming these girls for domestic labor, they were grooming them for pornographic material.
Yeah.
Like that's disgusting.
It really is. For me, it was just being able to do the research about how the profession was mostly taken over by women because as someone who went to private school and didn't actually realize that there could be such a thing as a male teacher for so long, and that's honest. I can't be more honest about that. Like that is just the way it was for me. And then when I would see a male teacher on TV or in a movie or in a cartoon, it didn't matter. It's just like, whatever. It's fiction. But
yeah.
I knew the headmaster was male, but I didn't realize that there could be male teachers until much later. So I never knew that. And now, like after doing the research on it, it's like, well, I mean, especially when the 1920s, when I did that research, and it was like only 16% of teachers were male of nearly 1 million teachers. Only 16%. Like,
well, that also ties into like the whole seriousness of women and having it be a male profession earlier on as a paid male profession, and then it turns into females are coming there after the Great Depression. Women are becoming teachers, and then the question of is it really a serious profession comes out because women are working there, and then having the men work as teachers as well, kind of bringing the serious note, bringing it as a paid profession. I think there's a link between what women were getting paid and the seriousness of their position.
I get where you're coming from, because I covered that a little bit with me as well, with the basically being taken advantage of. They were so willing to be teachers that they ended up with the low income, low labor costs and everything, like and a high turnover. So
looking for that independent income.
Exactly. So it's like, yay, here's the independent income that you're looking for. It's not a lot. You might be able to get by on it, but so.
Yeah, just enough to stay afloat.
Yeah.
And even then, sometimes it wasn't enough depending on what race you were a part of.
That's true too.
My presentation showed that perhaps these women were completely supported by the public, and to clarify, that was not the case. That was in one particular situation in my report. For the most part, they were harassed. People threw apples at them, threw papers at them. They felt they were taking advantage of the system. They felt they were government workers, and a lot of their pleas for help and for better treatment was to help the children. So a lot of the public actually questioned, is this for the children, or are they doing it for their own personal gain? And of course, those overlapped. So there was a lot of pushback from the public, more so than there was support for these unions.
And yet, from my research, the same guys who are saying men should take your jobs are the same ones who aren't even literate enough to do it in the first place.
Correct. Yep. Yep. That was super interesting.
Yeah, it's all because they're trying to step out of their women's sphere.
When I was filming your part, I got distracted both times, and then I got distracted when I was editing it as well. When you started talking about the women's sphere there, I got interested into that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I had a little diagram in there that like basically said what's in the circle. You know?
Exactly. Like I was just looking at it and I was like, maybe there's something more I can add to that. And I'm like, this is perfect. I love it.
Yeah, that diagram's great. Should end with something happy.
Ta-da!
Ta-da!